Dorothy and the Wizard in Oz by L. Frank Baum. Dedicated to Harriet A. B. Neal. To my readers, it's no use at all. The children won't let me stop telling tales of the land of Oz. I know lots of other stories, and I hope to tell them sometime or another, but just now my loving tyrants won't allow me. They cry, "Oz, Oz, more about Oz, Mr. Baum." And what can I do but obey their commands? This is our book, mine and the children's, for they have flooded me with thousands of suggestions in regard to it, and I have honestly tried to adopt as many of these suggestions as could be fitted into one story. After the wonderful success of Ozma of Oz, it is evident that Dorothy has become a firm fixture in these Oz stories. The little ones all love Dorothy, and as one of my small friends aptly states, it isn't a real Oz story without her. So, here she is again, as sweet and gentle and innocent as ever, I hope, and the heroine of another strange adventure. There were many requests from my little correspondents for more about the wizard. It seems the jolly old fellow made hosts of friends in the first Oz book, in spite of the fact that he frankly acknowledged himself a humbug. The children had heard how he mounted into the sky in a balloon, and they were all waiting for him to come down again. So, what could I do but tell what happened to the wizard afterward? You will find him in these pages, just the same humbug wizard as before. There was one thing the children demanded which I found it impossible to do in this present book. They bade me introduce Toto, Dorothy's little black dog who has many friends among my readers. But you will see, when you begin to read the story, that Toto was in Kansas, while Dorothy was in California, and so she had to start on her adventure without him. In this book, Dorothy had to take her kitten with her instead of her dog. But in the next Oz book, if I am permitted to write one, I intend to tell a good deal about Toto's further history. Princess Ozma, whom I love as much as my readers do, is again introduced in this story, and so are several of our old friends of Oz. You'll also become acquainted with Jim the cab horse, the 9 tiny piglets, and Eureka, the kitten. I am sorry, the kitten was not as well behaved as she ought to have been, but perhaps she wasn't brought up properly. Dorothy found her, you see, and who her parents were, nobody knows. I believe, my dears, that I am the proudest storyteller that ever lived. Many a time, tears of pride and joy have stood in my eyes while I read the tender, loving, appealing letters that came to me in almost every mail from my little readers. To have pleased you, to have interested you, to have won your friendship and perhaps your love through my stories, is to my mind as great an achievement as to become President of the United States. Indeed, I would much rather be your storyteller under these conditions than to be the president. So you have helped me to fulfill my life's ambition, and I am more grateful to you, my dears, than I can express in words. I try to answer every letter of my young correspondents, yet sometimes there are so many letters that a little time must pass before you get your answer. But be patient, friends, for the answer will surely come, and by writing to me, you more than repay me for the pleasant task of preparing these books. Besides, I am proud to acknowledge that the books are partly yours, for your suggestions often guide me in telling the stories, and I am sure they would not be half so good without your clever and thoughtful assistance. L. Frank Baum, Coronado, 1908. Chapter 1. The Earthquake. The train from Frisco was very late. It should have arrived at Hugson's Siding at midnight, but it was already 5 o'clock, and the grey dawn was breaking in the east when the little train slowly rumbled up to the open shed that served for the station house. As it came to a stop, the conductor called out in a loud voice, "Hugson's Siding?" At once, a little girl rose from her seat and walked to the door of the car, carrying a wicker suitcase in one hand and a round bird cage covered up with newspapers in the other, while a parasol was tucked under her arm. The conductor helped her off the car, and the engineer started his train again so that it puffed and groaned and moved slowly away up the track. The reason he was so late was because all through the night there were times when the solid earth shook and trembled under him, and the engineer was afraid that at any moment the rails might spread apart and an accident happen to his passengers. So he moved the cars slowly and with caution. The little girl stood still to watch until the train had disappeared around a curve, and then she turned to see where she was. The shed at Hugson's Siding was bare, save for an old wooden bench, and did not look very inviting. As she peered through the soft grey light, not a house of any sort was visible near the station, nor was any person in sight. But after a while, the child discovered a horse and buggy standing near a group of trees a short distance away. She walked toward it and found the horse tied to a tree and standing motionless, with its head hanging down almost to the ground. It was a big horse, tall and bony, with long legs and large knees and feet. She could count his ribs easily where they showed through the skin of his body, and his head was long and seemed altogether too big for him, as if it did not fit. His tail was short and scraggly, and his harness had been broken in many places and fastened together again with cords and bits of wire. The buggy seemed almost new, for it had a shiny top and side curtains. Getting around in front so that she could look inside, the girl saw a boy curled up on the seat, fast asleep. She set down the bird cage and poked the boy with a parasol. Presently he woke up, rose to a sitting position, and rubbed his eyes briskly. "Hello," he said, seeing her. "Are you Dorothy Gale?" "Yes," she answered, looking gravely at his tousled hair and blinking grey eyes. "Have you come to take me to Hugson's ranch?" "Oh, of course," he answered. "Train in?" "I couldn't be here if it wasn't," she said. He laughed at that, and his laugh was merry and frank. Jumping out of the buggy, he put Dorothy's suitcase under the seat and her bird cage on the floor in front. "Canary birds?" he asked. "Oh, no, it's just Eureka, my kitten. I thought that was the best way to carry her." The boy nodded. "Eureka's a funny name for a cat," he remarked. "I named my kitten that because I found it," she explained. "Uncle Henry says Eureka means I have found it." "All right. Hop in." She climbed into the buggy and he followed her. Then the boy picked up the reins, shook them, and said, "Giddy up." The horse did not stir. Dorothy thought he just wiggled one of his drooping ears, but that was all. "Giddy up," called the boy again. The horse stood still. "Perhaps," said Dorothy, "if you untied him, he would go." The boy laughed cheerfully and jumped out. "Guess I'm half asleep yet," he said, untying the horse. "But Jim knows his business all right, don't you, Jim?" patting the long nose of the animal. Then he got into the buggy again and took the reins, and the horse at once backed away from the tree, turned slowly around, and began to trot down the sandy road, which was just visible in the dim light. "Thought that train would never come," observed the boy. "I've waited at that station for 5 hours." We had a lot of earthquakes, said Dorothy. Didn't you feel the ground shake? Yes, but we're used to such things in California, he replied. They don't scare us much. The conductor said it was the worst quake he ever knew. Did he? Then it must have happened while I was asleep, he said thoughtfully. How is Uncle Henry? She inquired, after a pause, during which the horse continued to trot with long, regular strides. He's pretty well. He and Uncle Hugson have been having a fine visit. Is Mr. Hugson your uncle? She asked. Yes. Uncle Bill Hugson married your Uncle Henry's wife's sister, so we must be second cousins, said the boy in an amused tone. I work for Uncle Bill on his ranch, and he pays me $6 a month and my board. Isn't that a great deal? She asked doubtfully. Why, it's a great deal for Uncle Hugson, but not for me. I'm a splendid worker. I work as well as I sleep, he added with a laugh. What is your name? Said Dorothy, thinking she liked the boy's manner and the cheery tone of his voice. Not a very pretty one, he answered, as if a little ashamed. My whole name is Ǧᴏᴏᴏ, but folks just call me Zeb. You've been to Australia, haven't you? Yes, with Uncle Henry, she answered. We got to San Francisco a week ago, and Uncle Henry went right onto Hugson's ranch for a visit, while I stayed a few days in the city with some friends we had met. How long will you be with us? He asked. Only a day. Tomorrow, Uncle Henry and I must start back for Kansas. We've been away for a long time, you know, and we're so anxious to get home again. The boy flicked his big bony horse with his whip and looked thoughtful. Then he started to say something to his little companion, but before he could speak, the buggy began to sway dangerously from side to side, and the earth seemed to rise up before them. Next minute, there was a roar and a sharp crash, and at her side, Dorothy saw the ground open in a wide crack and then come together again. Goodness, she cried, grasping the iron rail of the seat. What was that? That was an awful big quake, replied Zeb with a white face. It almost got us that time, Dorothy. The horse had stopped short and stood firm as a rock. Zeb shook the reins and urged him to go, but Jim was stubborn. Then the boy cracked his whip and touched the animal's flanks with it, and after a low moan of protest, Jim stepped slowly along the road. Neither the boy nor the girl spoke again for some minutes. There was a breath of danger in the very air, and every few moments the earth would shake violently. Jim's ears were standing erect upon his head, and every muscle of his big body was tense as he trotted toward home. He was not going very fast, but on his flanks specks of foam began to appear, and at times he would tremble like a leaf. The sky had grown darker again, and the wind made queer sobbing sounds as it swept over the valley. Suddenly, there was a rending, tearing sound, and the earth split into another great crack, just beneath the spot where the horse was standing. With a wild neigh of terror, the animal fell bodily into the pit, drawing the buggy and its occupants after him. Dorothy grabbed fast hold of the buggy top, and the boy did the same. The sudden rush into space confused them so that they could not think. Blackness engulfed them on every side, and in breathless silence they waited for the fall to end and crush them against jagged rocks, or for the earth to close in on them again and bury them forever in its dreadful depths. The horrible sensation of falling, the darkness, and the terrifying noises proved more than Dorothy could endure, and for a few moments the little girl lost consciousness. Zeb, being a boy, did not faint, but he was badly frightened and clung to the buggy seat with a tight grip, expecting every moment would be his last. Chapter 2. The Glass City. When Dorothy recovered her senses, they were still falling, but not so fast. The top of the buggy caught the air like a parachute or an umbrella filled with wind, and held them back so that they floated downward with a gentle motion that was not so very disagreeable to bear. The worst thing was their terror of reaching the bottom of this great crack in the earth, and the natural fear that sudden death was about to overtake them at any moment. Crash after crash echoed far above their heads as the earth came together where it had split, and stones and chunks of clay rattled around them on every side. These they could not see, but they could feel them pelting the buggy top, and Jim screamed almost like a human being when the stone overtook him and struck his bony body. They did not really hurt the poor horse, because everything was falling together. Only the stones and rubbish fell faster than the horse and buggy, which were held back by the pressure of the air, so that the terrified animal was actually more frightened than he was injured. How long this state of things continued, Dorothy could not even guess. She was so greatly bewildered. But by and by, as she stared ahead into the black chasm with a beating heart, she began to dimly see the form of the horse Jim, his head up in the air, his ears erect, and his long legs sprawling in every direction as he tumbled through space. Also, turning her head, she found that she could see the boy beside her, who had until now remained as still and silent as she herself. Dorothy sighed and commenced to breathe easier. She began to realize that death was not in store for her after all, but that she had merely started upon another adventure, which promised to be just as queer and unusual as were those she had before encountered. With this thought in mind, the girl took heart and leaned her head over the side of the buggy to see where the strange light was coming from. Far below her, she found 6 great glowing balls suspended in the air. The central and largest one was white and reminded her of the sun. Around it were arranged, like the 5 points of a star, the other 5 brilliant balls, one being rose-colored, one violet, one yellow, one blue, and one orange. This splendid group of colored suns sent rays darting in every direction, and as the horse and buggy, with Dorothy and Zeb, sank steadily downward and came nearer to the lights, the rays began to take on all the delicate tintings of a rainbow, growing more and more distinct every moment until all the space was brilliantly illuminated. Dorothy was too dazed to say much, but she watched one of Jim's big ears turn to violet and the other to rose, and wondered that his tail should be yellow and his body striped with blue and orange like the stripes of a zebra. Then she looked at Zeb, whose face was blue and whose hair was pink, and gave a little laugh that sounded a bit nervous. "Isn't it funny?" she said. The boy was startled and his eyes were big. Dorothy had a green streak through the center of her face, where the blue and yellow lights came together, and her appearance seemed to add to his fright. "I don't see anything funny about it," he stammered. Just then, the buggy tipped slowly over upon its side, the body of the horse tipping also, but they continued to fall all together, and the boy and girl had no difficulty in remaining upon the seat just as they were before. Then they turned bottom side up and continued to roll slowly over until they were right side up again. During this time, Jim struggled frantically, all his legs kicking the air, but on finding himself in his former position, the horse said in a relieved tone of voice, "Well, that's better." Dorothy and Zeb looked at one another in wonder. "Can your horse talk?" she asked. "Never knew him to before," replied the boy. "Those were the first words I ever said," pulled out the horse, who had overheard them, "and I can't explain why I happened to speak then. This is a nice scrape you got me into, isn't it?" "As for that, we are in the same scrape ourselves," answered Dorothy cheerfully. "But never mind, something will happen pretty soon." "Of course," growled the horse, "and then we shall be sorry it happened." Zeb gave a shiver. All this was so terrible and unreal that he could not understand it all, and so had good reason to be afraid. Swiftly they drew near to the flaming coloured suns and passed close beside them. The light was then so bright that it dazzled their eyes, and they covered their faces with their hands to escape being blinded. There was no heat in the coloured suns, however, and after they had passed below them, the top of the buggy shut out many of the piercing rays, so that the boy and girl could open their eyes again. "We've got to come to the bottom sometime," remarked Zeb with a deep sigh. "We can't keep falling forever, you know." "Of course not," said Dorothy. "We are somewhere in the middle of the earth, and the chances are we'll reach the other side of it before long. But it's a big hollow, isn't it?" "Awful big," answered the boy. "We're coming to something now," announced the horse. At this, they both put their heads over the side of the buggy and looked down. Yes, there was land below them, and not so very far away either. But they were floating very, very slowly. So slowly that it could no longer be called a fall, and the children had ample time to take heart and look about them. They saw a landscape with mountains and plains, lakes and rivers, very like those upon the earth's surface, but all the scene was splendidly coloured by the variegated lights from the 6 suns. Here and there were groups of houses that seemed made of clear glass, because they sparkled so brightly. "I'm sure we are in no danger," said Dorothy in a sober voice. "We are falling so slowly that we can't be dashed to pieces when we land, and this country that we are coming to seems quite pretty." "We'll never get home again, though," declared Zeb with a groan. "Oh, I'm not so sure of that," replied the girl, "but don't let us worry over such things, Zeb. We can't help ourselves just now, you know, and I've always been told it's foolish to borrow trouble." The boy became silent, having no reply to so sensible a speech, and soon both were fully occupied in staring at the strange scene spread out below them. They seemed to be falling right into the middle of a big city, which had many tall buildings with glass domes and sharp-pointed spires. These spires were like great spear points, and if they tumbled upon one of them, they were likely to suffer serious injury. Jim, the horse, had seen these spires also, and his ears stood straight up with fear, while Dorothy and Zeb held their breaths in suspense. But no, they floated gently down upon a broad, flat roof and came to a stop at last. When Jim felt something firm under his feet, the poor beast's legs trembled so much that he could hardly stand, but Zeb at once leaped out of the buggy to the roof, and he was so awkward and hasty that he kicked over Dorothy's birdcage, which rolled out upon the roof so that the bottom came off. At once, the pink kitten crept out of the upset cage, sat down upon the glass roof, and yawned and blinked its round eyes. "Oh," said Dorothy, "there's Eureka." "First time I ever saw a pink cat," said Zeb. "Eureka isn't pink, she's white. It's this queer light that gives her that colour." "Where's my milk?" asked the kitten, looking up into Dorothy's face. "I'm most starved to death." "Oh, Eureka, can you talk?" "Talk? Am I talking?" "Good gracious, I believe I am. Isn't it funny?" asked the kitten. "It's all wrong," said Zeb gravely. "Animals not ought to talk, but even old Jim has been saying things since we had our accident." "I can't see that it's wrong," remarked Jim in his gruff tones. "At least it isn't as wrong as some other things. Oh, what's going to become of us now?" "I don't know," answered the boy, looking around him curiously. The houses of the city were all made of glass, so clear and transparent that one could look through the walls as easily as through a window. Dorothy saw, underneath the roof on which she stood, several rooms used for rest chambers, and even thought she could make out a number of queer forms huddled into the corners of these rooms. The roof beside them had a great hole smashed through it, and pieces of glass were lying scattered in every direction. A nearby steeple had been broken off short, and the fragments lay heaped beside it. Other buildings were cracked in places or had corners chipped off from them, but they must have been very beautiful before these accidents had happened to mar their perfection. The rainbow tints from the coloured suns fell upon the glass city softly, and gave to the buildings many delicate, shifting hues which were very pretty to see. But not a sound had broken the stillness since the strangers had arrived, except that of their own voices. They began to wonder if there were no people to inhabit this magnificent city of the inner world. Suddenly, a man appeared through a hole in the roof next to the one they were on and stepped into plain view. He was not a very large man, but was well formed and had a beautiful face, calm and serene as the face of a fine portrait. His clothing fitted his form snugly and was gorgeously coloured in brilliant shades of green, which varied as the sunbeams touched them, but was not wholly influenced by the solar rays. The man had taken a step or two across the glass roof before he noticed the presence of the strangers, but then he stopped abruptly. There was no expression of either fear or surprise upon his tranquil face, yet he must have been both astonished and afraid. For after his eyes had rested upon the ungainly form of the horse for a moment, he walked rapidly to the furthest edge of the roof, his head turned back over his shoulder to gaze at the strange animal. "Look out!" cried Dorothy, who noticed that the beautiful man did not look where he was going. "Be careful, or you'll fall off." But he paid no attention to her warning. He reached the edge of the tall roof, stepped 1 foot out into the air, and walked into space, as calmly as if he were on firm ground. The girl, greatly astonished, ran to lean over the edge of the roof and saw the man walking rapidly through the air toward the ground. Soon he reached the street and disappeared through a glass doorway into one of the glass buildings. "How strange!" she exclaimed, drawing a long breath. "Yes, but it's lots of fun if it is strange," remarked the small voice of the kitten, and Dorothy turned to find her pet walking in the air a foot or so away from the edge of the roof. "Come back, ʟɪᴏ," she called in distress. "You'll certainly be killed." "I have 9 lives," said the kitten, purring softly as it walked around in a circle and then came back to the roof. "But I can't lose even one of them by falling in this country, because I really couldn't manage to fall if I wanted to." "Does the air bear up your weight?" asked the girl. "Of course. Can't you see?" And again the kitten wandered into the air and back to the edge of the roof. "It's wonderful," said Dorothy. "Suppose we let ʟɪᴏ go down to the street and get someone to help us," suggested Zeb, who had been even more amazed than Dorothy at these strange happenings. "Perhaps we can walk on the air ourselves," replied the girl. Zeb drew back with a shiver. "I wouldn't dare try," he said. "Maybe Jim will go?" continued Dorothy, looking at the horse. "And maybe he won't," answered Jim. "I've tumbled through the air long enough to make me contented on this roof." "But we didn't tumble to the roof," said the girl. "By the time we reached there, we were floating very slowly, and I'm almost sure we could float down to the street without getting hurt. ʟɪᴏ walks on the air all right." "ʟɪᴏ weighs only about 1/2 a pound," replied the horse in a scornful tone, "while I weigh about 1/2 a ton." "You don't weigh as much as you ought to, Jim," remarked the girl, shaking her head as she looked at the animal. "You're dreadfully skinny." "Oh, well, I'm old," said the horse, hanging his head despondently. and I've had lots of trouble in my day, little one. For a good many years, I drew a public cab in Chicago, and that's enough to make anyone skinny." "He eats enough to get fat, I'm sure," said the boy gravely. "Do I? Can you remember any breakfast that I've had today?" growled Jim, as if he resented Zeb's speech. "None of us had breakfast," said the boy, "and in a time of danger like this, it's foolish to talk about eating." "Nothing is more dangerous than being without food," declared the horse, with a sniff at the rebuke of his young master. "And just at present, no one can tell whether there are any oats in this queer country or not. If there are, they are liable to be glass oats." "Oh no," exclaimed Dorothy. "I can see plenty of nice gardens and fields down below us at the edge of the city, but I wish we could find a way to get to the ground." "Why don't you walk down?" asked Eureka. "I'm as hungry as the horse is, and I want my milk." "Will you try it, Zeb?" asked the girl, turning to her companion. Zeb hesitated. He was still pale and frightened, for this dreadful adventure had upset him and made him nervous and worried. But he did not wish the little girl to think him a coward, so he advanced him slowly to the edge of the roof. Dorothy stretched out a hand to him, and Zeb put one foot out and let it rest in the air a little over the edge of the roof. It seemed firm enough to walk upon, so he took courage and put out the other foot. Dorothy kept hold of his hand and followed him, and soon they were both walking through the air, with the kitten frisking beside them. "Come on, Jim," called the boy. "It's all right." Jim had crept to the edge of the roof to look over, and being a sensible horse and quite experienced, he made up his mind that he could go where the others did. So, with a snort and a neigh and a whisk of his short tail, he trotted off the roof into the air, and at once began floating downward to the street. His great weight made him fall faster than the children walked, and he passed them on the way down. But when he came to the glass pavement, he alighted upon it so softly that he was not even jarred. "Well, well," said Dorothy, drawing a long breath. "What a strange country this is." People began to come out of the glass doors to look at the new arrivals, and pretty soon quite a crowd had assembled. There were men and women, but no children at all, and the folks were all beautifully formed and attractively dressed, and had wonderfully handsome faces. There was not an ugly person in all the throng, yet Dorothy was not especially pleased by the appearance of these people, because their features had no more expression than the faces of dolls. They did not smile, nor did they frown, or show either fear, or surprise, or curiosity, or friendliness. They simply started at the strangers, paying most attention to Jim and Eureka, for they had never before seen either a horse or a cat, and the children bore an outward resemblance to themselves. Pretty soon, a man joined the group who wore a glistening star in the dark hair just over his forehead. He seemed to be a person of authority, for the others pressed back to give him room. After turning his composed eyes first upon the animals, and then upon the children, he said to Zeb, who was a little taller than Dorothy, "Tell me, intruder, was it you who caused the rain of stones?" For a moment, the boy did not know what he meant by this question. Then, remembering the stones that had fallen with them and passed them long before they reached this place, he answered, "No, sir, we didn't cause anything. It was the earthquake." The man with the star stood for a time, quietly thinking over this speech. Then he asked, "What is an earthquake?" "I don't know," said Zeb, who was still confused. But Dorothy, seeing his perplexity, answered, "It's a shaking of the earth. In this quake, a big crack opened and we fell through. horse and buggy and all, and the stones got loose and came down with us." The man with the star regarded her with his calm, expressionless eyes. "The rain of stones has done much damage to our city," he said, "and we shall hold you responsible for it unless you can prove your innocence." "How can we do that?" asked the girl. "That I am not prepared to say. It is your affair, not mine. You must go to the house of the sorcerer, who will soon discover the truth." "Where is the house of the sorcerer?" the girl inquired. "I will lead you to it. Come." He turned and walked down the street, and after a moment's hesitation, Dorothy caught Eureka in her arms and climbed into the buggy. The boy took his seat beside her and said, "Get you up, Jim." As the horse ambled along, drawing the buggy, the people of the glass city made way for them and formed a procession in their rear. Slowly, they moved down one street and up another, turning first this way and then that, until they came to an open square in the center, of which was a big glass palace, having a central dome and 4 tall spires on each corner. Chapter 3. The Arrival of the Wizard. The doorway of the glass palace was quite big enough for the horse and buggy to enter, so Zeb drove straight through it, and the children found themselves in a lofty hall that was very beautiful. The people at once followed and formed a circle around the sides of the spacious room, leaving the horse and buggy and the man with the star to occupy the center of the hall. "Come to us, O Gwig," called the man in a loud voice. Instantly, a cloud of smoke appeared and rolled over the floor. Then it slowly spread and ascended into the dome, disclosing a strange personage seated upon a glass throne just before Jim's nose. He was formed just as were the other inhabitants of this land, and his clothing only differed from theirs in being bright yellow. But he had no hair at all, and all over his bald head and face and upon the backs of his hands grew sharp thorns like those found on the branches of the rose bushes. There was even a thorn upon the tip of his nose, and he looked so funny that Dorothy laughed when she saw him. The sorcerer, hearing the laugh, looked toward the little girl with cold, cruel eyes, and his glance made her grow sober in an instant. "Why have you dared to intrude your unwelcome person into the secluded land of the Mangaboos?" he asked sternly. "'Cause we couldn't help it," said Dorothy. "Why did you wickedly and viciously send the rain of stones to crack and break our houses?" he continued. "We didn't," declared the girl. "Prove it," cried the sorcerer. "We don't have to prove it," answered Dorothy indignantly. "If you had any sense at all, you'd known it was the earthquake." "We only know that yesterday came a rain of stones upon us, which did much damage and injured some of our people. Today came another rain of stones, and soon after it, you appeared among us." "By the way," said the man with the star, looking steadily at the sorcerer, "you told us yesterday that there would not be a second rain of stones. Yet one has just occurred that was even worse than the first. What is your sorcery good for if it cannot tell us the truth?" "My sorcery does tell the truth," declared the thorn-covered man. "I said there would be but one rain of stones. The second one was a rain of people and horse and buggy, and some stones came with them." "Will there be any more rains?" asked the man with the star. No, my prince. Neither stones nor people. No, my prince. Are you sure? Quite sure, my prince. My sorcery tells me so. Just then, a man came running into the hall and addressed the prince after making a low bow. More wonders in the air, my lord, said he. Immediately, the prince and all of his people flocked out of the hall into the street, that they might see what was about to happen. Dorothy and Zeb jumped out of the buggy and ran after them, but the sorcerer remained calmly in his throne. Far up in the air was an object that looked like a balloon. It was not so high as the glowing star of the 6 colored suns, but was descending slowly through the air, so slowly that at first it scarcely seemed to move. The throng stood still and waited. It was all they could do, for to go away and leave that strange sight was impossible, nor could they hurry its fall in any way. The Earth Children were not noticed, being so near the average size of the Mangaboos, and the horse had remained in the house of the sorcerer, with Eureka curled up asleep on the seat of the buggy. Gradually, the balloon grew bigger, which was proof that it was settling down upon the land of the Mangaboos. Dorothy was surprised to find how patient the people were, for her own little heart was beating rapidly with excitement. A balloon meant to her some other arrival from the surface of the earth, and she hoped it would be someone able to assist her and Zeb out of their difficulties. In an hour, the balloon had come near enough for her to see a basket suspended below it. In 2 hours, she could see a head looking over the side of the basket. In 3 hours, the big balloon settled slowly into the great square in which they stood, and came to rest on the glass pavement. Then the little man jumped out of the basket, took off his tall hat, and bowed very gracefully to the crowd of Mangaboos around him. He was quite an old little man, and his head was long and entirely bald. "Why," cried Dorothy in amazement, "it's Oz!" The little man looked toward her and seemed as much surprised as she was, but he smiled and bowed as he answered. "Yes, my dear, I am Oz, the great and terrible, eh? And you are little Dorothy from Kansas. I remember you very well." "Who did you say it was?" whispered Zeb to the girl. "It's the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Haven't you heard of him?" Just then the man with the star came and stood before the wizard. "Sir," said he, "why are you here in the land of the Mangaboos?" "Didn't know what land it was, my son," returned the other with a pleasant smile. "And, to be honest, I didn't mean to visit you when I started out. I live on top of the earth, your honor, which is far better than living inside it. But yesterday, I went up in a balloon, and when I came down, I fell into a big crack in the earth caused by an earthquake. I let so much gas out of my balloon that I could not rise again, and in a few minutes the earth closed over my head. So I continued to descend until I reached this place, and if you show me a way to get out of it, I'll go with pleasure. Sorry to have troubled you, but it couldn't be helped." The prince had listened with attention. Said he, "This child, who was from the crust of the earth like yourself, called you a wizard. Is not a wizard something like a sorcerer?" "Yes, better," replied Oz promptly. "1 wizard is worth 3 sorcerers." "Ah, you shall prove that," said the prince. "We Mangaboos have at the present time one of the most wonderful sorcerers that ever was picked from a bush. But he sometimes makes mistakes. Do you ever make mistakes?" "Never," declared the wizard boldly. "Oh, Oz," said Dorothy, "you made a lot of mistakes when you were in the marvelous land of Oz." "Nonsense," said the little man, turning red, although just then a ray of violet sunlight was on his round face. "Come with me," said the prince to him. "I wish to meet our sorcerer." The wizard did not like this invitation, but he could not refuse to accept it. So he followed the prince into the great domed hall, and Dorothy and Zeb came after them, while the throng of people trooped in also. There sat the thorny sorcerer in his chair of state, and when the wizard saw him, he began to laugh, uttering comical little chuckles. "What an absurd creature!" he exclaimed. "He may look absurd," said the prince in his quiet voice, "but he is an excellent sorcerer. The only fault I find with him is that he is so often wrong." "I am never wrong," answered the sorcerer. "Only a short time ago you told me there would be no more rain of stones or of people," said the prince. "Well, what then?" "Here is another person descended from the air to prove you were wrong." "One person cannot be called people," said the sorcerer. "If two should come out the sky, you might with justice say I was wrong, but unless more than this one appears, I will hold that I was right." "Very clever," said the wizard, nodding his head as if pleased. "I am delighted to find humbugs inside the earth, just the same as on top of it. Were you ever with a circus, brother?" "No," said the sorcerer. "You ought to join one," declared the little man seriously. "I belong to Balaam and Barney's great consolidated shows. 3 rings in one net and a menagerie on the side. It's a fine aggregation, I assure you." "What do you do?" asked the sorcerer. "I go up in a balloon usually to draw the crowds to the circus, but I've just had the bad luck to come out the sky, skip the solid earth, and land lower than I intended. But never mind, it isn't everybody gets a chance to see your land of the Gabezus." "Magaboos," said the sorcerer, correcting him. "If you are a wizard, you ought to be able to call people by their right names." "Oh, I'm a wizard, you may be sure of that. Just as good a wizard as you are a sorcerer." "That remains to be seen," said the other. "If you are able to prove that you are better," said the prince to the little man, "I will make you the chief wizard of this domain. Otherwise—" "What will happen otherwise?" asked the wizard. "I will stop you from living and forbid you to be planted," returned the prince. "That does not sound especially pleasant," said the little man, looking at the one with the star uneasily. "But never mind. I'll be told prickly, all right." "My name is Gwig," said the sorcerer, turning his heartless, cruel eyes upon his rival. "Let me see you equal the sorcery I am about to perform." He waved a thorny hand, and at once the tinkling of bells was heard, playing sweet music. Yet look where she would, Dorothy could discover no bells at all in the great glass hall. The Mangaboo people listened, but showed no great interest. It was one of the things Gwig usually did to prove he was a sorcerer. Now it was the wizard's turn, so he smiled upon the assemblage and asked, "Will somebody kindly loan me a hat?" No one did, because the Mangaboos did not wear hats, and Zeb had lost his somehow in his flight through the air. "Ahem," said the wizard. "Will somebody please loan me a handkerchief?" But they had no handkerchiefs either. "Very good," remarked the wizard. "I'll use my own hat, if you please. Now, good people, observe me carefully. You see, there is nothing up my sleeve and nothing concealed about my person. Also, my hat is quite empty." He took off his hat and held it upside down, shaking it briskly. "Let me see it," said the sorcerer. He took the hat and examined it carefully, returning it afterward to the wizard. "Now," said the little man, "I will create something out of nothing." He placed the hat upon the glass floor, made a pass with his hand, and then removed the hat, displaying a little white piglet no bigger than a mouse, which began to run around here and there and to grunt and squeal in a tiny, shrill voice. The people watched it intently, for they had never seen a pig before, big or little. The wizard reached out, caught the wee creature in his hand, and holding its head between one thumb and finger, and its tail between the other thumb and finger, he pulled it apart, each of the two parts becoming a whole and separate piglet in an instant. He placed one upon the floor so that it could run around, and pulled apart the other, making 3 piglets in all, and then one of these was pulled apart, making 4 piglets. The wizard continued the surprising performance until 9 tiny piglets were running about at his feet, all squealing and grunting in a very comical way. "Now," said the Wizard of Oz, "having created something from nothing, I will make something nothing again." With this, he caught up 2 of the piglets and pushed them together so that the 2 are one. Then he caught up another piglet and pushed it into the first, where it disappeared. And so one by one, the 9 tiny piglets were pushed together until but a single one of the creatures remained. This the wizard placed underneath his hat and made a mystic sign above it. When he removed his hat, the last piglet had disappeared entirely. The little man gave a bow to the silent throng that had watched him, and then the prince said in his cold, calm voice, "You are indeed a wonderful wizard, and your powers are greater than those of my sorcerer." "He will not be a wonderful wizard long," remarked Gwig. "Why not?" inquired the wizard. "Because I am going to stop your breath," was the reply. "I perceive that you are curiously constructed, and that if you cannot breathe, you cannot keep alive." The little man looked troubled. "How long will it take you to stop my breath?" he asked. "About 5 minutes. I'm going to begin now. Watch me carefully." He began making queer signs and passes toward the wizard. The little man did not watch him long. Instead, he drew a leathern case from his pocket and took from it several sharp knives which he joined together one after another until they made a long sword. By the time he had attached a handle to the sword, he was having much trouble to breathe, as the charm of the sorcerer was beginning to take effect. So, the wizard lost no more time, but leaping forward, he raised the sharp sword, whirled it once or twice around his head, and then gave a mighty stroke that cut the body of the sorcerer exactly in 2. Dorothy screamed and expected to see a terrible sight, but as the 2 halves of the sorcerer fell apart on the floor, she saw that he had no bones or blood inside of him at all, and that the place where he was cut looked much like a sliced turnip or potato. "Why, he's a vegetable!" cried the wizard, astonished. "Of course," said the prince. "We are all vegetable in this country. Are you not vegetable also?" "No," answered the wizard. "People on top of the earth are all meat. Will your sorcerer die?" "Certainly, sir. He is really dead now and will wither very quickly. So we must plant him at once, that other sorcerers may grow upon his bush," continued the prince. "What do you mean by that?" asked the little wizard, greatly puzzled. "If you will accompany me to our public gardens," replied the prince, "I will explain to you much better than I can here the mysteries of our vegetable kingdom." Chapter 4. The Vegetable Kingdom. After the wizard had wiped the dampness from his sword and taken it apart and put the pieces into their leathern case again, the man with the star ordered some of his people to carry the 2 halves of the sorcerer to the public gardens. Jim pricked up his ears when he heard they were going to the gardens and wanted to join the party, thinking he might find something proper to eat. So Zeb put down the top of the buggy, and invited the wizard to ride with them. The seat was amply wide enough for the little man and the two children, and when Jim started to leave the hall, the kitten jumped upon his back and sat there quite contentedly. So the procession moved through the streets, the bearers of the sorcerer first, the prince next, then Jim drawing the buggy with the strangers inside of it, and last, a crowd of vegetable people who had no hearts and could neither smile nor frown. The glass city had several fine streets, for a good many people lived there, but when the procession had passed through these, it came upon a broad plain covered with gardens, and watered by many pretty brooks that flowed through it. There were paths through these gardens, and over some of the brooks were ornamental glass bridges. Dorothy and Zeb now got out of the buggy and walked beside the prince, so that they might see and examine the flowers and plants better. "Who built these lovely bridges?" asked the little girl. "No one built them," answered the man with the star. "They grow." "That's queer," she said. "The glass houses in your city grow too?" "Of course," he replied, "but it took a good many years for them to grow as large and fine as they are now. That is why we are so angry when a rain of stones comes to break our towers and crack our roofs." "Can't you mend them?" she inquired. "No, but they will grow together again in time, and we must wait until they do." They first passed through many beautiful gardens of flowers which grew nearest the city, but Dorothy could hardly tell what kind of flowers they were, because the colors were constantly changing under the shifting light of the 6 suns. A flower would be pink one second, white the next, then blue or yellow, and it was the same way when they came to the plants, which had broad leaves and grew close to the ground. When they passed over a field of grass, Jim immediately stretched down his head and began to nibble. "A nice country this is," he grumbled, "where a respectable horse has to eat pink grass." "It's violet," said the wizard who was in the buggy. "Now it's blue," complained the horse. "As a matter of fact, I'm eating rainbow grass." "How does it taste?" asked the wizard. "Not bad at all," said Jim. "If they give me plenty of it, I'll not complain about its color." By this time, the party had reached a freshly ploughed field, and the prince said to Dorothy, "This is our planting ground." Several mangaboos came forward with glass spades and dug a hole in the ground. Then they put the 2 halves of the sorcerer into it and covered him up. After that, other people brought water from a brook and sprinkled the earth. "He will sprout very soon," said the prince, "and grow into a large bush, from which we shall in time be able to pick several very good sorcerers." "Do all your people grow on bushes?" asked the boy. "Certainly," was the reply. "Do not all people grow upon bushes where you came from, on the outside of the earth?" "Not that I ever hear of." "How strange. But if you will come with me to one of our folk gardens, I will show you the way we grow in the land of the mangaboos." It appeared that these odd people, while they were able to walk through the air with ease, usually moved upon the ground in the ordinary way. There were no stairs in their houses, because they did not need them, but on a level surface they generally walked just as we do. The little party of strangers now followed the prince across a few more of the glass bridges and along several paths until they came to a garden enclosed by a high hedge. Jim had refused to leave the field of grass where he was engaged in busily eating, so the wizard got out of the buggy and joined Zeb and Dorothy, and the kitten followed demurely at their heels. Inside the hedge, they came upon row after row of large and handsome plants, with broad leaves gracefully curving until their points nearly reached the ground. In the center of each plant grew a daintily dressed mangaboo, for the clothing of all these creatures grew upon them and was attached to their bodies. The growing mangaboos were of all sizes, from the blossom that had just turned into a wee baby to the full-grown and almost ripe man or woman. On some of the bushes might be seen a bud, a blossom, a baby, a half-grown person, and a ripe one, but even those ready to pluck were motionless and silent, as if devoid of life. This sight explained to Dorothy why she had seen no children among the mangaboos, a thing she had until now been unable to account for. Our people do not acquire their real life until they leave their bushes, said the prince. You will notice they are all attached to the plants by the soles of their feet, and when they are quite ripe, they are easily separated from the stems and at once attain the powers of motion and speech. So while they grow, they cannot be said to really live, and they must be picked before they can become good citizens. How long do you live after you are picked? Asked Dorothy. That depends on the care we take of ourselves, he replied. If we keep cool and moist and meet with no accidents, we often live for 5 years. I've been picked over 6 years, but our family is known to be especially long-lived. Do you eat? Asked the boy. Eat? No, indeed. We are quite solid inside our bodies and have no need to eat, any more than does a potato. But the potatoes sometimes sprout, said Zeb. And sometimes we do, answered the prince, but that is considered a great misfortune, for then we must be planted at once. Where do you grow? Asked the wizard. I will show you, was the reply. Step this way, please. He led them within another but smaller circle of hedge, where grew one large and beautiful bush. This, said he, is the royal bush of the mangaboos. All of our princes and rulers have grown upon this one bush from time immemorial. They stood before it in silent admiration. On the central stalk stood poised the figure of a girl, so exquisitely formed and colored, and so lovely in the expression of her delicate features, that Dorothy thought she had never seen so sweet and adorable creature in all her life. The maiden's gown was soft as satin and fell upon her in ample folds, while dainty lace-like traceries trimmed the bodice and sleeves. Her flesh was fine and smooth as polished ivory, and her poise expressed both dignity and grace. Who is this? Asked the wizard curiously. The prince had been staring hard at the girl in the bush. Now he answered, with a touch of uneasiness in his cold tones. She is ruler destined to be my successor, for she is a royal princess. When she becomes fully ripe, I must abandon the sovereignty of the mangaboos to her. Isn't she ripe now? Asked Dorothy. He hesitated. Not quite, said he finally. It will be several days before she needs to be picked, or at least that is my judgment. I am in no hurry to resign my office and be planted, you may be sure. Probably not, declared the wizard, nodding. This is one of the most unpleasant things about our vegetable lives, continued the prince with a sigh. That while we are in our full prime, we must give way to another, and be covered up in the ground to sprout and grow, and give birth to other people. I'm sure the princess is ready to be picked, asserted Dorothy, gazing hard at the beautiful girl in the bush. She's as perfect as she can be."
"Never mind," answered the prince hastily. "She will be all right for a few days longer, and it is best for me to rule until I can dispose of you strangers who have come to our land uninvited and must be attended to at once."
"What are you going to do with us?" asked Zeb.
"That is a matter I have not quite decided upon," was the reply. "I think I shall keep this wizard until a new sorcerer is ready to pick, for he seems quite skillful and may be of use to us. But the rest of you must be destroyed in some way, and you cannot be planted, because I do not wish horses and cats and meat people growing all over our country."
"You needn't worry," said Dorothy. "We wouldn't grow underground, I'm sure."
"But why destroy my friends?" asked the little wizard. "Why not let them live?" "They do not belong here," returned the prince. "They have no right to be inside the earth at all."
"We didn't ask to come down here, we fell," said Dorothy.
"That is no excuse," declared the prince coldly.
The children looked at each other in perplexity, and the wizard sighed. Eureka rubbed her paw in her face and said in a soft, purring voice, "He won't need to destroy me, for if I don't get something to eat pretty soon, I shall starve to death, and so save him the trouble."
"If he planted you, he might grow some cattails," suggested the wizard.
"Oh, Eureka, perhaps we can find you some milkweeds to eat," said the boy. "Ooh," snarled the kitten, "I wouldn't touch the nasty things." "You don't need milk, Eureka," remarked Dorothy. "You are big enough now to eat any kind of food." "If I can get it," added Eureka. "I'm hungry myself," said Zeb, "but I noticed some strawberries growing in one of the gardens and some melons in another place. These people don't eat such things, so perhaps on our way back they'll let us get them."
"Never mind your hunger," interrupted the prince. "I shall order you destroyed in a few minutes, so you will have no need to ruin our pretty melon vines and berry bushes. Follow me, please, to meet your doom."
Chapter 5. Dorothy Picks the Princess. The words of the cold and moist vegetable prince were not very comforting, and as he spoke them, he turned away and left the enclosure. The children, feeling sad and despondent, were about to follow him when the wizard touched Dorothy softly on her shoulder. "Wait," he whispered. "What for?" asked the girl.
"Suppose we pick the royal princess," said the wizard. "I'm quite sure she's ripe, and as soon as she comes to life she'll be the ruler, and may treat us better than that heartless prince intends to."
"All right," exclaimed Dorothy eagerly. "Let's pick her while we have the chance, before the man with the star comes back." So together they leaned over the great bush, and each of them seized one hand of the lovely princess. "Pull!" cried Dorothy, and as they did so, the royal lady leaned toward them, and the stems snapped and separated from her feet. She was not at all heavy, so the wizard and Dorothy managed to lift her gently to the ground. The beautiful creature passed her hands over her eyes an instant, tucked in a stray lock of hair that had become disarranged, and after a look around the garden made those present a gracious bow and said in a sweet but even-toned voice, "I thank you very much."
"We salute your royal highness," cried the wizard, kneeling and kissing her hand.
Just then, the voice of the prince was heard calling upon them to hasten, and a moment later he returned to the enclosure, followed by a number of his people. Instantly, The princess turned and faced him, and when he saw that she was picked, the prince stood still and began to tremble. "Sir," said the royal lady with much dignity, "you have wronged me greatly, and would have wronged me still more had not these strangers came to my rescue. I have been ready for picking all the past week, but because you are selfish and desired to continue your unlawful rule, you left me to stand silent upon my bush." "I did not know that you were ripe," answered the prince in a low voice. "Give me the star of royalty," she commanded. Slowly, he took the shining star from his brow and placed it upon that of the princess. Then all the people bowed low to her, and the prince turned and walked away alone. What became of him afterward, our friends never knew. The people of ʟɪᴏᴏ now formed themselves into a procession and marched towards the glass city to escort their new ruler to her palace and perform those ceremonies proper to the occasion. But while the people in the procession walked upon the ground, the princess walked in the air just above their heads to show that she was a superior being and more exalted than her subjects. No one now seemed to pay any attention to the strangers, so Dorothy and Zeb and the wizard let the train pass on, and then wandered by themselves into the vegetable gardens. They did not bother to cross the bridges over the brooks, but when they came to a stream, they stepped high and walked in the air to the other side. This was a very interesting experience to them, and Dorothy said, "I wonder why it is that we can walk so easily in the air." "Perhaps," answered the wizard, "it is because we are close to the center of the earth, where the attraction of gravitation is very slight. But I've noticed that many queer things happen in fairy countries." "Is this a fairy country?" asked the boy. "Of course it is," returned Dorothy promptly. "Only a fairy country could have vegetable people, and only in a fairy country could ʟɪᴏᴏ and Jim talk as we do." "That's true," said Zeb thoughtfully. In the vegetable gardens, they found the strawberries and melons, and several other unknown but delicious fruits, of which they ate heartily. But the kitten bothered them constantly by demanding milk or meat, and called the wizard names because he could not bring her a dish of milk by means of his magical arts. As they sat upon the grass watching Jim, who was still busily eating, Eureka said, "I don't believe you are a wizard at all." "No," answered the little man, "you are quite right. In the strict sense of the word, I am not a wizard, but only a humbug." "The Wizard of Oz has always been a humbug," agreed Dorothy. "I've known him for a long time." "If that is so," said the boy, "how could he do that wonderful trick with the 9 tiny piglets?" "Don't know," said Dorothy, "but it must have been humbug." "Very true," declared the wizard, nodding at her. "It was necessary to deceive that ugly sorcerer and the prince, as well as their stupid people. But I don't mind telling you, who are my friends, that the thing was only a trick." "But I saw the little pigs with my own eyes," exclaimed Zeb. "So did I," purred the kitten. "To be sure," answered the wizard. "You saw them because they were there. They're in my inside pocket now. But the pulling of them apart and pushing them together again was only a sleight of hand trick." "Let's see the pigs," said Eureka eagerly. The little man felt carefully in his pocket and pulled out the tiny piglets, setting them upon the grass one by one, where they ran around and nibbled the tender blades. "They're hungry too," he said. "Oh, what cunning things!" cried Dorothy, catching up one and petting it. "Be careful," said the piglet with a squeal. "You're squeezing me." "Dear me," murmured the wizard, looking at his pets in astonishment. "They can actually talk." "May I eat one of them?" asked the kitten in a pleading voice. "I'm awfully hungry. Why, Eureka, said Dorothy reproachfully, what a cruel question. It would be dreadful to eat these dear little things. I should say so, grunted another of the piglets, looking uneasily at the kitten. Cats are cruel things. I'm not cruel, replied the kitten, yawning. I'm just hungry. You cannot eat my piglets, even if you are starving, declared the little man in a stern voice. They are the only things I have to prove I'm a wizard. How did they happen to be so little? Asked Dorothy. I never saw such small pigs before. They are from the island of ʟɪᴍᴏᴏᴜ, said the wizard, where everything is small because it's a small island. The sailor brought them to Los Angeles, and I gave him 9 tickets to the circus for them. But what am I going to eat? Wailed the kitten, sitting in front of Dorothy and looking pleadingly into her face. There are no cows here to give milk, or any mice, or even grasshoppers. And if I can't eat the piglets, you may as well plant me at once and raise cats up. I have an idea, said the wizard, that there are fishes in these brooks. Do you like fish? Fish? Cried the kitten. Do I like fish? Why, they're better than piglets, or even milk. Then I'll try to catch you some, said he. But won't they be vegetable, like everything else here? Asked the kitten. I think not. Fishes are not animals, and they are as cold and moist as the vegetables themselves. There is no reason that I can see why they may not exist in the waters of this strange country. Then the wizard bent a pin for a hook and took a long piece of string from his pocket for a fish line. The only bait he could find was a bright red blossom from a flower, but he knew fishes are easy to fool if anything bright attracts their attention, so he decided to try the blossom. Having thrown the end of his line in the water of a nearby brook, he soon felt a sharp tug that told him a fish had bitten and was caught on the bent pin. So the little man drew in the string, and sure enough, the fish came with it and was landed safely on the shore, where it began to flop around in great excitement. The fish was fat and round, and its scales glistened like beautifully cut jewels set close together. But there was no time to examine it closely, for Eureka made a jump and caught it between her claws, and in a few moments it had entirely disappeared. Oh, Eureka! Cried Dorothy. Did you eat the bones? If it had any bones, I ate them, replied the kitten composedly as it washed its face after the meal. But I don't think that fish had any bones, because I didn't feel them scratch my throat. You were very greedy, said the girl. I was very hungry, replied the kitten. The little pigs had stood huddled in a group, watching this scene with frightened eyes. Cats are dreadful creatures, said one of them. I'm glad we are not fishes, said another. Don't worry, Dorothy murmured soothingly. I'll not let the kitten hurt you. Then she remembered that in the corner of her suitcase were 1 or 2 crackers that were left over from her luncheon on the train, and she went to the buggy and brought them. Eureka stuck up her nose at such food, but the tiny piglet squealed delightedly at the sight of the crackers and ate them up in a jiffy. Now, let us go back to the city, suggested the wizard. That is, if Jim has had enough of the pink grass. The cab horse, who was browsing near, lifted his head with a sigh. I've tried to eat a lot while I had the chance, said he, for it's likely to be a long while between meals in this strange country. But I'm ready to go now at any time you wish. So, after the wizard had put the piglets back into his inside pocket, where they cuddled up and went to sleep, the 3 climbed into the buggy, and Jim started back to the town. Where shall we stay? Asked the girl.
I think I shall take possession of the house of a sorcerer, replied the wizard, for the prince said in the presence of his people that he would keep me until they picked another sorcerer, and the new princess won't know but that we belong there.
They agreed to this plan, and when they reached the great square, Jim drew the buggy into the big door of the domed hall. It doesn't look very home-like, said Dorothy, gazing around at the bare room, but it's a place to stay anyhow.
What are those holes up there? Inquired the boy, pointing to some openings that appeared in the top of the dome.
They look like doorways, said Dorothy, only there are no stairs to get to them.
You forget that stairs are necessary, observed the wizard. Let us walk up and see where the doors lead to.
With this, he began walking in the air toward the high openings, and Dorothy and Zeb followed him. It was the same sort of climb one experiences when walking up a hill, and they were nearly out of breath when they came to the row of openings, which they perceived to be doorways leading into halls in the upper part of the house. Following these halls, they discovered many small rooms opening from them, and some were furnished with glass benches, tables, and chairs. But there were no beds at all. I wonder if these people never sleep, said the girl.
Why, there seems to be no night at all in this country, Zeb replied. Those colored suns are exactly in the same place they were when we came, and if there is no sunset, then there can be no night. Very true, agreed the wizard, but it is a long time since I have had any sleep and I'm tired. So I think I shall lie down upon one of these hard glass benches and take a nap.
I will too, said Dorothy, and chose the little room at the end of the hall.
Zeb walked down again to unharness Jim, who, when he found himself free, rolled over a few times and then settled down to sleep, with Eureka nestling comfortably beside his big bony body. Then the boy returned to one of the upper rooms, and, in spite of the hardness of the glass bench, was soon deep